Hi, everyone. This is a lecture covering the water cycle. It's going to cover chapter 42.4 and 42.5, which is on page 752 of your textbook. So we've gone over water quite a bit, but we also want to understand where water comes from and how it gets to organisms from anywhere else on Earth. So because of that, that's why we're going over the water cycle. So we're going to cover the biogeochemical cycle as a concept, and some key aspects that are always found in biogeochemical cycles like reservoirs, and then we'll specifically go into the water cycle itself. So, in terms of the biogeochemical cycles, the basic idea is that elements essential to life move between a community, meaning the living organisms, and the environment in a biogeochemical cycle. So, nutrients are in reservoirs. Environmental reservoirs are basically non living sites where a nutrient is stored, like the atmosphere, rocks, sediments, seawater, fresh water, while living organisms are, humans, plants, etc., where the water may be stored or where the nutrient may be stored inside their cells. Okay, so that's the idea. So, and also a big thing here is we're talking about nutrients when we talk about these cycles. And recall, nutrients cycle; they flow around the earth and through the earth, and they keep getting recycled over and over again, versus energy, which is one way. It comes in through the sun, it flows through organisms, and eventually dissipates back to the universe. Now, when we talk about nutrients, some of the big nutrients that we tend to track within cycles, at least for biology, is water, which is the one we're going to go over today. But there's some other ones that are pretty big that we may cover later in the year, like carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. FYI. So, reservoirs are a big concept that comes up in any biogeochemical cycle, whether we're talking about water or carbon or phosphorus. So a reservoir is the location for a large amount of a given nutrient. And in this location, if it's considered a reservoir, nutrients can move into that reservoir and they can leave that reservoir in the cycle. This is slightly different than what's known as a resource sink. So a resource sink is a location meant to actually store a nutrient for a long period of time so that it doesn't re-enter the cycle and go back to other locations on Earth. A reservoir is a location on Earth where that nutrient gets to, but it can leave quite quickly and move to a different location through a chemical or geological process. Okay, so in this case, here's an example of some reservoirs. So the ocean is considered a reservoir. Water can flow into the ocean, it can evaporate out of the ocean or move into an organism. Same thing with carbon. So carbon, for instance, can go into life through photosynthesis. So plants take in carbon from the air, carbon dioxide, puts it in its tissues, and that's a big reservoir for carbon. But a sink is an example of something where carbon might go to, and it's not meant to leave often, and that would be fossil fuels. So fossil fuels for a very long time, for millions and billions of years, was more like millions, was a rich source where organisms died and then their body may have decomposed, and then the carbon in their body stayed in the ground and eventually became fossil fuels. The reason why we're concerned now is that carbon is now being pumped into the air when it was supposed to stay within those sinks, which is a big issue when it comes to the use and burning of fossil fuels. So that's sink. So what's happening right now with human activity is something that is meant to be a sink, like fossil fuels for carbon, is no longer serving its purpose as a sink, which is a storage function, where it's not constantly entering Earth in areas where life interacts. Okay, so what is the water cycle? So the water cycle is basically how water moves to Earth. That's pretty clear. But the big thing about the water cycle is sunlight really drives the water cycle by causing evaporation. So water on Earth evaporates into the air, and then it's going to allow that water to move elsewhere. Also, when water evaporates into the air and that water that moves is clean now because only the water evaporates theoretically rather than whatever else was in that water reservoir that the water was stored in. So anything gross that might have been in the ocean, anything gross that might have been in the lake stays behind, and only the water enters the air and then can be go into a cloud and then return back to the earth as precipitation. And assuming the air is relatively clean, that water should ideally be a little bit cleaner when it returns back to the earth. Now, how water moves is we get that drive from evaporation powered by the sun into those clouds that condense, and then we have precipitation allowing it to go back onto land and then drain into a particular watershed. When it gets onto earth, that precipitation may seep into the ground, and when it's in the earth, that water is called groundwater because it's in the ground. It's groundwater. And sometimes that water naturally drifts and then collects into like something like looks almost like a lake or a river underneath the soil. And those collections of just water underneath the soil are called aquifers. Because that water went through all this soil, it often gets filtered, and by the time it reaches to the aquifer where it went through a lot of soil, it's often actually quite clean, or at least cleaner than the water that was more towards the surface of the ground rather than deep within that aquifer. So that's why people tend to drill into the ground to get water through a well, because ideally that water down in the ground in the aquifer is a lot cleaner than whatever they grab out of the lake. All right. So, anyways, that surface water, though, is what we call runoff. So, runoff on the surface of the land, if it's not soaked into the ground, it then eventually moves into rivers and oceans. And unfortunately, because it's running off through the land and back into the oceans or river, it typically picks up any pollution or any other things that are on the surface of the earth on its way back to the oceans or the rivers or lakes. So sometimes people call the water cycle the hydrologic cycle because hydro, the root word, means water. So just a heads up. And this is a picture of the of the water cycle. You can also find a picture of the water cycle in the pages of your textbook that this chapter is associated with for chapter 42.5. You're also going to see some other images of the water cycle in our class as well through some other resources. Okay, so some important aspects of the water cycle that I want to highlight. So the reason why the water cycle is so critical and why we talk about it quite a bit and why we talk about water quite a bit is because water basically provides the way we dissolve and access nutrients. So a lot of nutrients have to be dissolved into water for them to be taken into the cells of our bodies. So our cells rely on water to access things. In addition to that, water actually helps provide the supportive environment of our cells and surrounding our cells, keeping them protected. So our bodies really rely on having lots of water in them in order to maintain the cells that we need for life. And then that water also provides the environment for any molecules we need for life, like proteins or carbohydrates or lipids, to act the way they do. Now, a big thing about water is, at least on Earth, most of it is stored in the ocean. In fact, 97% of water is stored in the ocean. However, most of the water that we, as humans at least, need to drink is actually stored inside ice, particularly ice caps and glaciers. That becomes kind of critical because it allows, if we do have ice, year-round water, because when there's an excess of water in the winter, then some of that water is stored in the ice and in the snow caps and glaciers in our area. And then ideally in the summer, those glacier and snow caps will melt a little bit and at a steady rate and then release that water into rivers and lakes that humans can still access. That's the idea anyways. May not be the case so much now with global warming making unpredictable climate change, but that's the idea. And still, even with all this global warming, most of our fresh water is still stored inside ice reservoirs on Earth, such as this. All right, so how do large organisms obtain water at least? We basically absorb or drink it from sources, often fresh water. Organisms that live in really salty areas like the ocean and other areas, they typically, like fish that live in the ocean, they typically have methods for dealing with the salt and preventing salt from entering their tissue and body, rather than just purely absorbing that salty water, okay? But for at least humans and a lot of plants, we actually need fresh water. And a big part of the water cycle is where we can obtain that fresh water. So we do have groundwater, where a lot of the water that reaches lands can filter through the ground. And we also have those ice caps we mentioned, as well as rivers and lakes. Now, key thing we also want to point out is that within the water cycle, there are methods of filtering and cleaning the water so that when organisms do access it, they're not getting all the grime and gross stuff in the stuff they drink. So there are some processes in the water cycle. One of them is percolation. So when I mentioned that water, as it goes through the ground and reaches the aquifer, it gets a little bit of filter. That is percolation. Another aspect of filtering water besides evaporation is something called transpiration, which is actually evaporation through plants. So as plants take in water, they bring the water, which can sometimes be dirty, through its tissues, through its cells, and then its cells kind of pick up the grime and other gross stuff. And as the water exits the plants and then evaporates into the air, it's both a lot cleaner, and a lot of the gross stuff that may have been in the water is now stuck inside the plant. So transpiration also provides a really good way of filtering the water that's on Earth as it moves through the cycles. And just a heads up, groundwater doesn't just include the water in the soil, but anything in the ground, which includes the aquifers that are below the soil, because still, even though it's a kind of a river or lake below the soil, it's still, the ground. So groundwater includes not just the water in the soil, but also those aquifers beneath it. All right, so that concludes this lesson. Just some reminders. Nutrients like to cycle through the earth between living things and environmental reservoirs. Something is classified as a nutrient when it's used by life. So that's why we say, hey, it's both in living organisms as well as reservoirs on Earth that are non-living. Okay, reservoirs, by the way, is just that large storage location for a nutrient. This is slightly different than what's known as a sink, where that nutrient is meant to be stored for a long period of time and not entering or re-entering the cycle very easily. Water is an essential nutrient. That's why we talk about it quite a bit, because it is critical to dissolving other nutrients that we may need, and it allows organisms to have healthy cells and have an environment for the cells that are supportive. And a lot of that evaporation that drives the water cycle and moves it around is powered by the sun. And just FYI, we want to know that little extra bit of fact where most of the water on Earth is stored in the ocean, but most of the drinking water that a lot of organisms like humans rely on is actually stored in fresh snow and ice, which is found in like the ice caps and glaciers, etc. This is some of the key vocabulary that kind of came up in the lesson. And even if some of them may have not been defined, like evaporation, you're still expected to know what they are. So if there is a term that's here that you don't recognize, then you might want to look into it and look it up in your textbook. All right, have a good day. Bye.